Hello, everyone. We're going to give people a couple minutes to get logged on, and then we'll get started.
Man, Chancela, I feel like I've just opened a time capsule. I'm back in the Bay Area.
I know, exactly. Just full disclosure, I met Jody before I even went to law school, right out of college.
Right, Vassar.
Yeah, exactly, Vassar.
Fresh from New York City, back to the West Coast.
Yeah, exactly. It's just been a minute, that's all. Great to see you too.
Yes, we're gonna have a good talk. I'm looking forward to this.
Yes.
All right, we're gonna get started here. Good afternoon, my name is Olivia. I am the Vice Co-Chair of the Los Angeles Lawyer Chapter of the American Constitution Society. Welcome to each and every one of you for joining us today for our fourth panel in our series of discussions on racial justice and the law with Professor Armour as our moderator. ACS Los Angeles has committed to challenging and disrupting systems of oppression by launching a series of discussions focused on unpacking and understanding systemic racism within the context of various areas of the law, as well as sharing recommendations and law and policy that you can use to uplift the movement for equity and justice. The discussion will focus on our country's history of racist housing policies, redlining, blockbusting, restrictive covenants, restrictive zoning, etc., and how these policies have resulted in over-policing and disinvestment in Black and Brown communities. The discussion will also address how the pandemic has exacerbated housing insecurity within these communities and the looming expiration of the moratorium on evictions at the federal level. Finally, the discussion will include advocacy approaches and tools to help address these disparities. We would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors, the Mexican American Bar Association, the ACS Bay Area, San Diego, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Austin lawyer chapters, and the ACS student chapters from USC and Loyola Law School. We also have 1 hour of CLE credit available for this event. If you need any information on that, you can refer to the event page. And we also have a Q&A section at the end of the event. So please submit all of your questions through the Q&A chat function. I would now like to take a minute to introduce our esteemed panelists and moderator. In the interest of keeping things brief, I will just give a short introduction and you can check out each of their amazing careers and accomplishments online later. So our moderator today is Professor Jody David Armour. He is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. Professor Armour has recently released a book on his own unique critical race theory entitled N*GGA, Race, Language, Unequal Justice in the Law. Links to purchase N*GGA theory will be added to the chat. Chancela Al-Mansour is Executive Director of the Housing Rights Center in Southern California. She has chaired the California Reinvestment Coalition and serves on the boards of the National Fair Housing Alliance and several homelessness prevention committees. She has authored articles on fair housing advocacy and lectured at UCLA, Loyola Law School, and USC Gould School of Law. Claudia Medina is an LA native and tenants' rights attorney here in Los Angeles with over 12 years of experience defending and representing tenants in cases involving slum housing, eviction, and illegal rent increases, illegal eviction, harassment, and discrimination. So without further ado, and thanks so much to our panelists and moderator, I will pass the baton to Jody.
All right, thanks very much. Appreciate that very much, Olivia. And I'm going to kind of set the stage by connecting this to the other three series discussions we've had to this point, because I do kind of think that there is a seamless web that interconnects them. And often that interconnectedness isn't fully recognized. We started out with the Constitution, precedent, and systemic racism, and considered how racism may have a systemic function, play a systemic role through constitutional law and precedent, right? And we started to grapple with the idea of systemic racism, structural racism. What is that? How is that different from prejudice? How is it different from stereotypes or bias? You know, and so that's a kind of a constant question theme that we've been entertaining as we go through our discussions here, so we can get some clarity about that. We then went on to voting rights and considered, you know, the value of the vote for one thing, whether it did make a difference, could make a difference, would make a difference. We debated that, as well as the Voting Rights Act, et cetera, of course. Then we looked at education justice and the role that racial justice plays in education policy. And you know, again, connected that back to systemic racism. Is that, can you have a face of systemic racism be the education system, crumbling schools, et cetera? And then now today, we're going to look at housing equity, spaces and flows, race, place, class, and crime, I think, and talk a lot about. You can't drive through any large city and not have to think about race, place, class, and crime. Through every neighborhood you go, you see shifts in the demographics, shifts in the socioeconomic profile. I've even had people in my own neighborhood here in View Park, referred to by the LA Times a little while ago as Black Beverly Hills, come to me and tell me that when some folks from other neighborhoods were visiting, both kids and adults, we don't want Compton up here. I've heard a sheriff's deputy tell my event planner, we don't want South Central up here, even though we live in South Central, but we're in the hills. Somehow that's different than South Central somehow. And I got to see really firsthand how there is a racial geography of, you know, others. You know, we otherize through what we do with spaces and flows. And so we're going to get a chance to think hard about that today as we think about housing equity. And I'm going to start the discussion off with someone I first ran across when she just got out of Vassar, came back to the Bay Area. I'll start with attorney Al-Mansour, Chancela Al-Mansour. Can you discuss, please, and yeah, I'll get to my other point in a moment because I want to launch in with you first. Can you discuss, please, the connection between the history of racist exclusionary housing policies and wealth building within communities of color? Because what I just talked about was, you know, one wealthy community saying we don't want members of a less wealthy community in our community, even though we're of the same, you know, race, if you will. So yeah, could you talk to us about that, please?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for having me. As everybody knows, even if you don't know about this topic in depth, it's a huge topic, and I, you know, we could spend days talking about going back before the Civil War, going back to, you know, the Manifest Destiny and the whole obligation that this government seemed to have for whites and for people in power with money to come to the West to take property, to take land. So if you really want to talk about the divestiture of property from people of color, it goes back to what happened to our indigenous populations in the state of California, and to the Indian Act that legalized the slavery of Indian children and Native American children, you know, over 100 years ago, and all the other exclusionary policies also, right, from the Chinese Exclusionary Act to the Japanese Removal Act to, you know, a myriad of acts that have gone against people of color. But what this government really did, what our government really did that really institutionalized systemic racism, that really set us on track for where we are today, is the invention of redlining. And I think that, you know, when I do these talks and I really think about all the different exclusionary zoning ordinances and policies and historical discriminatory acts, the restrictive covenants and policies and deeds, you know, that have restricted private land transfers and so forth. All of them are bad, all of them are horrible. But I think that redlining probably is the most insidious in terms of how the impact that we still see today based on the redlining map that were created in 1939 after the New Deal. So basically, this government, we didn't have federally backed mortgages. So after the Depression, a lot of homeowners lost their homes, and the government and everybody was in shock and turmoil. And that's when our government institutionalized and implemented a lot of federal agencies like the FHA, the federal and housing agencies and so forth. That it's, you know, that was kind of the beginning where public housing and subsidized housing was first thought of. But also the government decided that it was going to federally back mortgages so that people would not be at such a risk of losing their homes. So in order to do so, the government said, well, for us to do this determination of what's a good investment for private and for government investment and property, they first said, well, let's look at the United States. Let's divide the United States up by the major cities. And let's do a map, color-coded map, where we do borders to determine what's the best area for investment. And in doing these maps, what they actually did was they said that this is where people can live. Remember, these maps were created in 1939, and at that time, a lot of these, the areas weren't even that well populated or didn't have significant people of color living there, but it was determined back in 1939 that this is where people of color, in particular Black people, and then other considered less desirable ethnic groups also, that this is the only place where they could live in the future. So for example, I'm sharing my screen here. I'm sorry, let me do this. Can you see my screen?
No.
No.
You can't, okay, I mean. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm once again having problems sharing my screen. Let me just try one more.
Abound with this new technology. I've run into a lot of them myself.
The crazy thing is I've done it a number of times, and depending on what I'm using, it always seems to be an issue, but I think.
There you go, something's happening, yeah.
Yeah, something's happening. Okay, so, and I'm gonna just go off camera for a quick second so I can look at this without looking directly into each of you. So this is a redlining map of the city of Los Angeles, created in 1939. Basically, the federal government contracted with the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a private corporation, to develop these maps to determine where real estate investment should be. So if you're familiar with Los Angeles at all, this is the Pacific Ocean, this is the Santa Monica, Venice area. And the areas that are red are where are literally red lines. Within those boundaries, that's where the only place where Blacks, Mexicans, the term back then, very offensive terms for Asians as well. And then other kind of less desirable people to some degree, like some Eastern European, people from Czechoslovakia, some Jewish people, Eastern Europeans, they were deemed only to be able to live in these areas that were either red if they were Black, yellow, maybe if they were the other ethnic groups I just talked about. Blue was considered to be more highly desirable, up and coming, and green was the most highly desirable, high valued places where people could live. So it's interesting, people, when I first looked at these maps, I said, well, why is this area around Santa Monica like not redlined right on the ocean? That's like some of the most expensive housing. Well, if you think about it, there's not a whole lot of housing there. There's small bungalows there and that type of thing. And it's because, Los Angelinos, people with wealth, whites, they wanted to live in Hollywood and Hancock Park, Beverly Hills. The Pacific Ocean and the beach area was really like the summer resort kind of area. And so that's all, and where workers could live, which is why people of color, in particular Blacks and Latinos, actually lived in that area around that time. But you see, like, this is like the Beverly Hills area right in here. You see the delineation of like Wilshire Boulevard and south of it, where the 10 freeway would be right in here. This is downtown Los Angeles, the Figueroa corridor going right in here, where USC is, right in here. So you see, if the area that Professor Armour was just talking about, right kind of down in here. So this area right in here, which is green and blue, more highly desirable, that's kind of like mid-city LA, the area that we would know now as the country club area, where like the wealthy people and the I'm forgetting their names right now, Bugsy Siegel or whoever, they lived and where the big mansions were in this area, right in kind of mid-city LA. So that's why that area is green now, and it wouldn't necessarily be green. It was green then, wouldn't necessarily be green now. And so, and that's basically how they were created. I'm going to show a little bit more. This is a little bit more in depth. Let me get to And let me show one other also, the Pasadena San Gabriel Valley area, if you're familiar with Pasadena San Gabriel Valley. So I'm going to start over here. This over here is like the Rose Bowl, Aurora Seco area, the Brookside Park, where the old Brookside, before the Aquatic Center, that's where the pool was that was segregated through the 1960s. Blacks weren't allowed to swim there until they were sued. And then even after they were sued, they would allow Blacks to only swim on Tuesdays, and they would drain the pool Tuesday nights and reopen it on Wednesdays. But if you're familiar, lots of litigation up to the Supreme Court from John Muir High School was the first high school in Pasadena that was ordered for busing and to be desegregated, and in the 1960s, and that led to extreme white flight from the Pasadena Unified School District into private schools in Pasadena. But also you may wonder, well, why is there blue right next to red right here? Like, why would you have green so close to red? So if you're familiar with the story of Jackie Robinson, number 42, famous LA Dodger, he grew up in Pasadena, he and his brother, Mac Robinson. Mac Robinson's widow still lives and is very active in the Pasadena Black community. But their mother was a maid, and their mother owned a small home. And that area in Pasadena was really a lot of wealthy whites from the Chicago area, from New York, the Gambles, the Wrigleys. They moved to Pasadena with their big mansions. They were used to having Black people live in their neighborhoods. They didn't abide by the new wealth of white Los Angelenos who didn't want Blacks near them. They weren't used to having Blacks as maids and servants. So those communities tend to go to the Glendale, San Marino areas that had sundown laws. That's why you don't have a significant Black populations in Glendale, San Marino, the areas around Pasadena. The only area you really have Black home ownership is in Pasadena and Altadena. And that's because those are the only areas that did not have sundown, did not really implement their sundown laws. They wanted Blacks to be able to live near their mansion so they could walk from their home in Northwest Pasadena right here to the mansion that they worked in. If you're also familiar with San Gabriel Valley, you'll know that there's not a whole lot of Blacks in between like the Pasadena area until you get out to the Pomona area. This is like a little insert of Pomona, which would obviously be all the way over here. And Pomona, has a significant Black population and Latino population. Again, it was because back in 1939, there weren't that many Blacks who lived out there, but this government decided that that's where Blacks would be able to live. And so they designated that part of Pomona as a place in the space where Blacks would be able to live, which is why that part of Pomona has a significant Black population. If you're familiar with Pomona also, you'll know that the 210 freeway runs kind of right through it. And you see that, it's green. Those are the hills of Pomona where it is green and so forth. This is the San Fernando Valley. When I first came to Los Angeles, I worked at Neighborhood Legal Services for a number of years as a legal aid attorney, came to know the San Fernando Valley very well. So again, this is 1939. Back in 1939, there really wasn't any housing residential development above the North Hollywood area and up into the valley. It was mostly orange groves, farmland, especially in the East San Fernando Valley. This is basically where the 10 freeway kind of is now, and you end up after, the 5 freeway, you end up after about 15, 20 minutes in Pacoima. This is all the city of Los Angeles, by the way. This is all the city of LA. San Fernando is not, but Pacoima is. But basically back then, that's where they decided that that's, if Blacks did, if they could afford to move out of other parts of Los Angeles, the only place where they were allowed to purchase and live was in Pacoima. So that was the area that was determined where Blacks could live. And if you know the San Fernando Valley and the history of it, you know that that's exactly what happened. That's exactly where the very thriving Black community in the San Fernando Valley, I'm talking about the Broadus family and so forth, the Andre Crouches, the famous gospel singer, and his family all grew up and lived in Pacoima. And another kind of interesting thing right around here is where Panorama City is now. I'm just going to cut to one other kind of a housing policy that wasn't racist on the face of it, but the implementation of it definitely was, and that was the GI Bill. The GI Bill after World War II, our government, our legislator decided that they were going to give special housing grants and loans, low-interest loans and grants to returning veterans so that they could purchase homes. But the Republican senators, especially out of Texas, basically made it very difficult and put policies in place so that Black GIs and other GIs of other races could not really kind of take advantage of the GI Bill. So, and Panorama City is one of those cities that was developed with the intended funding of the resources that would come to people through the GI Bill. And it was also where the plants were. It's where the General Motors plants were. So there was industry there and so forth. If you're familiar with Panorama City, if you drive through Van Nuys Boulevard, you see there's still the plant, the homage to the industrial plants that are there now. It's like a movie theater and a shopping mall now. But Richard Nixon was very big in coming there in the 1950s and really promoting white home ownership. And Panorama City had very strong racially restrictive covenants there where it was mandated that you had to have language in every single deed that you would not sell your home to a Black family or individual. So they really maintained to keep Panorama City really white. But what happened was after Panorama City and the industries ended up leaving that area, it suffered from economic blight. And so the interesting thing now is that Panorama City now, I don't think there are any white residents or very few in Panorama City now. And it kind of really dilapidated. But that kind of leads me into one final thing I want to say, and I don't want to take up all the time right now about redlining in terms of the ramifications in terms of what we saw with redlining, is that that's where the government determined that not only should housing be determined where people should live, but all sources of investment, from hospitals to industry, to greater secondary schools and things like that. So communities that were redlined, not only were they deprived of good investments where people could, if you lived in a red line area, that's the only place you could live. You weren't allowed to get another type of loan to help you do a home improvement or an equity loan, help you to buy other property, help you to even keep your own home up. So what happened was, because investments weren't allowed in those red line areas that Blacks lived in, and they weren't able to get other loans to refinance to do home improvements, and it just intensified and exacerbated the blight in those areas. And it just set those areas and those neighborhoods up for the taking that we've seen in the last 20 years for gentrification, because those areas were so undervalued, the houses were so undervalued, and so forth. It just kind of set us up for failure. So I'm just going to show a couple other things. This is a couple of in Pacoima. They were born and raised in Pacoima. They live in a homeless encampment under the 118 freeway with over 100 other Black residents. All grew up in Pacoima. They all live within a mile of where their families owned homes. And I'm going to end there because I can always jump into something else in a little bit.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. That is very helpful. I think that a lot of us aren't aware of just how, in that kind of granular detail, how deliberate the decisions were to segregate, folk of color in America, Black people in particular, and then a lot of other people, needless to say, as well. And I'm thinking about, before going on to Claudia, I'm going to jump right to you right away, Claudia. I just want to think for one moment about Chancela, what you were saying about redlining and how it connects with a phenomenon I've heard come up in the literature referred to as blue lining. And blue lining is the decision by police departments, the policy decisions to concentrate their enforcement resources on certain neighborhoods, right? And so they blue line certain neighborhoods, and that's where the officers go, that's where the enforcement is. And there's obviously a lot of overlap between the red line places and the blue line places. And it explains a lot about the constant kind of fraught relations between police and these communities and certain neighborhoods, because it'd be a lot harder to do that if you had, for example, Black folks dispersed throughout the city. You couldn't really zero in on a neighborhood and blue line it, right? The whole city. You have to come up with something else, some kind of wide net that then a lot of white people would say, no, 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 not in my backyard are you going to do that kind of dragnet, BS. So it could have really changed the whole law enforcement Black community dynamic to have had something other than redlining going on, which made possible blue lining. But Claudia, Attorney Medina, can you talk about how the lack of affordable housing in Los Angeles has contributed to the displacement of low-income residents? This is one of the hottest topics that I see all the time coming across my timeline.
Well, I mean, when I thought about that question, this is what came to mind. So keeping in mind the history of institutionalized racism, racial covenants, redlining, and we recognize now, right, fast forward decades later, how LA became to be so segregated, right? Because communities of color were corralled into these parts of the city that were undesirable. And this isn't something that was just happening in LA, it was happening across the country. So that led to this cycle of disinvestment in our communities, like Boyle Heights, like Watts, right? So then you have a high concentration of people of color in certain areas of LA, and that was due to a very intentional government sanctioned effort, right? So you actually then fast forward to the 80s and the 90s, which is, I want to start talking about gentrification and lack of affordable housing. You have what you could call naturally occurring affordable housing because of disinvestment, right? So when you got a wave of immigrants, of new immigrants in the 80s and the 90s, that's where they settled because that's where they could afford, because you had naturally occurring affordable housing. It had a lot to do with rent control. You had a lot of rent control, older housing, right? That was affordable because of this history of disinvestment, right? So you did have affordable housing in that sense. But then what started happening around the 90s, I would say in LA, I would say it started happening like first in certain parts of LA, it was a massive gentrification that then spread like a virus. So Venice, Oakwood, right? Like that starts happening there to the Black community there. That's now essentially been extinguished. It spread to areas like Hollywood, right? Then Echo Park, which is my experience in that, in Echo Park and seeing the gentrification in Echo Park is what motivated me to get into housing, right? You saw the loss of affordable housing because of that, right? So I see displacement as causing the loss of affordable housing, right? Not the other way around. And the way that displacement happens is because then when a certain area that has suffered from decades of disinvestment becomes cool, becomes hot, right? Now you attract all the speculative predators, right? And so now there's a big profit to be gained because of decades of disinvestment in those communities. Those properties are cheap, right? So then you could come in, buy for cheap, get these people out and reap a massive profit. And so that at some point, things changed, right? Things changed in the 90s in LA. I think a lot of it was maybe racial attitudes where, oh, you know, if we go to Echo Park, we're not gonna get robbed and killed like we previously thought. Something made those areas appealing and started attracting a wider, wealthier demographic, and then started that shift and got that ball rolling in the city. So then it just spread, Venice, Hollywood, Echo Park, Highland Park, my old neighborhood, Elysian Valley, everywhere. Now Koreatown, where I've lived in for 16 years, right? And it's just gonna keep growing. That's what I keep saying, it's gonna keep growing like a cancer, like a virus, right? But that's what's happening right now. And that's leading to the loss of affordable housing. And that's leading to displacement.
Wow, okay. And certainly even here in the Crenshaw district, you see it happen.
Sure, everywhere. What neighborhood? I feel like communities of color are under attack.
There is, and then it's Los Angeles. I know I've been told that our audience is primarily from Los Angeles, but obviously Washington, D.C., Brooklyn, you know, Seattle, Oakland, San Francisco. There's a movie came out a couple of years ago, The Last Black Man in San Francisco, and so forth. It's quite, I'm from the Oakland area. It's quite sad. And personally, my story of the displacement occurs because there were some Blacks that were allowed to purchase and to get homes in the 1940s and 50s. My grandparents were, even though neither one of them had more than an elementary school education. My grandfather was basically illiterate, but because they, you know, he worked in a shipyard in Oakland, loading bombs into the ships and so forth. She worked for a Chinese American family. They were able to save their money and purchase a home using a last name Sweeney, an Irish name. They thought my grandfather may have been Irish, and so that may have helped also. But they were able to have 3 homes and so forth. And I talked to a lot of Black and Latino landlords and apartment owners in South LA, and they have very similar stories. How they were able to get a home, they were able to purchase home, maybe even an apartment complex as some type of extra income. And in the last 10 years, 15 years, I hear a lot of complaints about how hard it is to keep residential property and so forth, about how expensive it is, how the earthquake retrofitting and soft retrofitting for the parking structures was an unanticipated cost and so forth. And so what's happening is a lot of them are selling their properties to developers and to these large complexes and managers who won't allow a family to go maybe with a few months without paying rent, like a lot of the small, the other, especially Black and Latino landlords would. So I like to stress, when I talk about the importance of home ownership, I talk about the importance also of keeping, for apartment owners, of keeping Black and Latino apartment owners as well, and keeping their properties as well. Not just that they're all perfect by any means. We get lots of discrimination complaints as well, but there's definitely a sense of, at least of empathy and understanding and about their tenants, and more so than the corporate developers and the larger landlords we see, where if you're late and you're out, and that's it. The other quick thing I want to say about this displacement that we see everywhere in terms of the other factors, there's a lot of blame to go around. A lot of people blame the expansion of transit corridors in our community. You know, that's all everybody talked about, was getting the blue lines and the bus lines and the corridors, these transit corridors into the Crenshaw district in South LA, into East LA. But what it really did is it also really intensified just gentrification displacement, because, you know, young people don't necessarily want to live out in the suburbs. They don't need a car. They're fine with living in a neighborhood where there's, you know, some great ethnicity and that type of thing, and where they can rely on public transportation. So it actually really accelerated it in Los Angeles. The public
and to add to that, there is a correlation between expansion of transit, right? The metro train system and gentrification. So that is something that once you start planning for Metro Rail to get expanded into certain areas like Crenshaw, right? That's what we saw. Like, people really wanted the rail system, they wanted to stop there, right? I think that's the Crenshaw Subway Coalition was born out of those efforts. And then, you know, they got that, and then that caused that part of the city to be attractive to.
It opened it up. People drove in the neighborhoods and they were like, oh, these are nice homes here. They don't have graffiti all over them.
Yeah, and so you go, well, it just is, there's a correlation between, okay, now when you have a rail stop, when you have the train coming through there, you're going to be able to attract a certain demographic. So that's what makes that area hot, right? And then you get the predators that now are looking to make a buck, right? Now looking at that area, which is what happened at Crenshaw. But what is concerning to me is that knowing this, right? Knowing that there's a national trend, a movement back into the city, when there's these efforts, right, to invest or to bring light rail into a neighborhood, why not before that already have a plan in place to mitigate the gentrification that's going to bring, right? And there isn't that way of thinking. Like, we're not operating within a framework of disinvestment in the urban core or areas around the urban core anymore. That's done, that's gone, at least not in most major cities, right? Because as you said, like, this is happening in Seattle, this is happening in Oakland, this is happening in DC, right? So knowing that and understanding those dynamics, understand that then bringing that type of investment or acting in a way that's going to attract that kind of investment means that you need to implement efforts to protect the small businesses and the existing residents that made that place their home in spite of years, decades of disinvestment. And for me, that is concerning and angering, to be frank, that there's not enough of that way of thinking from electeds. I have encountered electeds that they're still operating within a framework of disinvestment. It's like they're stuck in the early 90s or the 80s still. And I feel like saying like, wake up, disinvestment is now a thing of the past in a lot of these areas, if not most of these areas.
Well, you really gotten us into the next question then, which is what kind of, what's the most important kind of public policy intervention that we can make to increase affordable housing and reduce housing inequities of the kind that you folks have identified so well.
Get rid of that strip tenants of agency. For example, after this wave of tenant activism caused a lot of cities to implement rent control in California because it was easier for a lot of these tenant coalitions to mobilize and have influence on the local level. Then what did the landlord lobby do, right? Like their dollars were more effective in Sacramento, right? And that was the case in New York. That was the case in Massachusetts. Okay, when tenant activism leads to local laws that protect tenants, you can't beat the organizing and the activism, so just use your lobbying dollars to go up to the state legislature and quell that from there. So getting rid of certain state laws that prevent local control or local tenant influence, right? So the Costa-Hawkins, which minimizes the ability of cities to implement or expand their rent control. Getting rid of the Ellis Act, that is horrible, right? Because when you bring in new development, that means that your stock of rent control housing, which is affordable, gets demolished. And right now that's benefiting developers. Like the poster child of the Ellis Act was the mom and pop landlord in Santa Monica that wasn't allowed to withdraw from the rental market. I don't even think that was ever really the demographic that was most impacted. But definitely now, the ones reaping the most benefits from the Ellis Act and a landlord's ability to just demolish rent control housing, it's developers. So things like that, like looking at laws and getting rid of laws that prevent local jurisdictions from implementing stronger tenant protections. That's just some idea.
Yeah, and I would look at it from going back to what housing advocates always look at in terms of the 3 Ps. So one in terms of affordable housing, that there's the production of affordable housing. That's always an issue. There's the NIMBYism that comes up. There's the neighborhood council opposition whenever from everything from even a very temporary homeless site for people experiencing homelessness, extreme neighborhood opposition to that. We had that in Koreatown and other areas of LA City as well. So there's always that, even the more desirable groups. So I'm talking about like over 65 seniors housing, even those projects oftentimes face some community opposition as well. So there's definitely that. 2, there's who gets to live in this housing. So one of the things, I'm the executive director of the Housing Rights Center, and one of the main complaints we get here is that people will say, I saw a brand new complex was being built in my neighborhood in South LA and Pasadena and so forth. And we were watching being built. It was beautiful, grand opening sign, and balloons were put on the outside. We went and said, when can we put our name on the waiting list? And then we were told the waiting list is full and all the places are already filled, and people from outside the neighborhood are now moving in. So I hear that all the time from groups in East LA.
I hear that a lot too. Yeah.
Where because everybody's saying, oh, there's going to be new affordable housing built, and then the community members say, I don't get to live there.
Well, we never found out about the application process. Yeah, so that's
so and the way fair housing laws work, you can't do set asides or to give preferences to people. But that is one thing that some communities have tried to do, was to get residential preferences. So for example, like in Hunters Point in San Francisco, and in Bay Point, I know they applied to HUD to get preferences for the local residents to have the first choice of the new units and the affordable housing developments. But those kind of things definitely need to be done to make sure that people have their first choice into those housing developments. And then also in terms of the marketing of those units, when those units become available, who gets to know about those units? So there's a property Northwest Pasadena, all area that used to be 100% Black, now it's Black and Latinx. And Kings Village Public Housing is right across the street. It's a beautiful senior development of about 60 units, gate around it. It's used to be all Black. Now there's only maybe 1 or 2 Black seniors that live there. I get complaints constantly that they have no way to even find out when there's no sign up saying for rent or anything's available. Basically what I found out is that they recruit from a church in St. Gabriel that serves Chinese Americans, and they help them out with their application process. And now that development is about 80% Chinese American and Northwest Pasadena. And so you have those kind of forces happen also, where people who are considered to be more desirable, even within low-income communities, are kind of pitched against each other for those few affordable housing units. And so that's also one of the major complaints. The same thing, there's a building in downtown LA, Hope's Village on 11th, same exact complaint there as well, that the Blacks, they're never able to get in, the marketing is not done to their communities as well. So it's just one other thing. There's NIMBYism, there's marketing, and there's who gets to live in these places.
And I wanted to add also that there needs to be more interest in cooperative ownership, right? So in New York, for example, things have gotten so bad that it finally, due to organizing effort from tenant advocates, it led to the city actually funding housing land trust efforts, right? So that was actually codified at the local level and supported with local dollars, right? So right now, as of now, the city of LA has shown no interest in that. In terms of, and when I say that, I mean electeds in the city of LA, right? And I'm hoping now with Nithya Raman being an urban planner and really caring about housing issues, that we'll start hearing more of those conversations being had at the local level, because I know I've tried to initiate those conversations with electeds, and like to them, it's like a foreign topic, right? And it's just disheartening again, because it's not something like so novel and foreign that like it's being done across the country. So why can't LA do it? Right? It's not such a radical, novel topic that it should be dismissed.
So there are some interventions I'm hearing, and I know we could spend a lot more time talking about them, and they are very important because they're rubber meet the road kinds of issues. I want to get on to one other issue though. Before that, I'm thinking about one other intervention came to mind as you were talking that I'll kind of just throw out. You made me think of it, especially Claudia, when you talked about people not taking account of the impact of these public works projects, these rails and so forth, on the affordability of housing in the neighborhood, on gentrification. So maybe along with environmental impact statements, we can start requiring for these kinds of projects, inclusion, diversity, and equity impact statements of some kind, gentrification impact statements. But what
sounds like a great idea.
What about what I think is on a lot of folks' minds right now? These emergency, the sunset in the emergency eviction moratorium, right? That we're looking at running into. How are housing folk going to deal with the onslaught of evictions that could follow?
Yeah, that's a problem, and that's really concerning, because if that moratorium is not extended, that we are going to see a tsunami of filings come. I think the earliest that tenants have to start paying rent would be February. So we're going to see a massive wave of evictions, which puts tenants at risk, right, of COVID, and also puts tenant advocates at risk, because they're the ones that would then be forced into court, which was actually happening. I think people realize that the court system, at least in LA, resumed jury trials. And so they actually were forcing tenants and their advocates into court to do these jury trials, like in the past few weeks.
And giving sanctions to attorneys who refuse to go to court. There have been attorneys, eviction defense attorneys and their clients who both said they're high risk, so they joined in by Court Connect, and they were sanctioned for doing so. Orange County just yesterday announced that they were going to suspend courtroom jury trials, I think again. So it's interesting that Orange County did faster than the LA Superior Courts. But yes, as Claudia just said, LA, and because trials are happening right now, they just stopped the new filings. They're hearing the cases that were filed before March, before everything happened.
That's death cult stuff. I can't describe that any other way. That's a death cult.
Yeah, and I've heard from my clients and our attorneys as well that, you know, you also have some sheriffs, some of the bailiffs who are refusing to some of them aren't wearing masks in the courtrooms. The courtroom, some of the smaller courtrooms, like the courthouse in Covina, you can't socially distance there. It's an older courthouse. So the judges are saying you can't congregate in the courtroom, but they're telling everybody to stand out in the hallway. So everybody's in the hallway, crowded up in the hallways right now. So yeah, that's happening right now in LA Superior Courts, trying to do eviction defense. The sheriffs started to implement started to execute vacate orders. Again, they had stopped temporarily, but they started to do those again. So those are things we need to stop. We need to get the sheriff's department to stop executing the notice to vacates. We need to have the courts, stop these mandatory in-person jury trials and things like that. And we need a more extended funding to help renters. It is, as Claudia said, in California, we're in a little bit better position than some other cities and some other states in terms of the tenant protections we have. At least AB 3088 converted rent to consumer debt for 75% of your rent until the end of January. So as long as a tenant does a declaration, signs a declaration, gives it to their landlord saying, I can't pay all my rent, then at least that may protect them from some eviction if they can come up with at least 25% of their rent. But those are the kind of the fine lines we're walking right now to try to keep people houses as much as possible.
And I want to clarify, it's not a moratorium, right? Because a landlord could still get a tenant's declaration saying, I'm not able to pay rent because of COVID. And a landlord could just shrug and say, I'm still going to fund eviction action, right? And then it might not go very far. It shouldn't go very far procedurally, but then it still puts the burden on tenants to have to defend themselves. So it's more of a tenant protection. It gives tenants protections, and it needs to be extended because we're dealing with new lockdown orders and there's no jobs. Like, where are tenants supposed to come up with the money to pay this back rent or start paying rent in February when there are no jobs for them to start earning that money to pay the rent? So we definitely need an extension of the current protections, and we need better protections.
I've seen, reported video of resistance in the streets to evictions by sheriffs of people from their homes. And I couldn't help but think, if we did get that tsunami of evictions, I could see that, or thought about the possibility of that energy that we saw on the streets this summer, 6 weeks in a row, the millions of people, when you summed them all together, saying we aren't going to stand for turning our nation into, even more of a homeless, houseless haven. We have the fiercest expression of structural violence in America right here in LA, with the highest concentration of houseless people right in downtown in Skid Row. And when you walk through there, you see that 75% of the faces are Black, not right. That it becomes real clear that Black lives matter, or don't matter when it comes to these kinds of housing decisions. If that catches on, who knows what kind of resistance we could see. What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm a member of the LA Tenants Union, and so they've been very active. My fellow LA Tenants Union members have been very active, along with other tenant advocates, in forming a rapid response team, because before a landlord could evict a tenant, they have to go through the court system. That's mandatory. You have to give the tenant due process. But what was happening was that because there was a freeze in those filings, for months, and landlords were turning to self-help, illegal evictions. So what they would do would be just change the locks with the tenants things still in there, and then call the cops, right? The sheriffs or the LAPD to facilitate in that lockout. And even before this pandemic, as a tenant attorney, I have encountered several situations, even before the pandemic, over the course of the years that I've been practicing, where I would have to show up to a tenant's home because they're calling me saying, LAPD is here, and they're saying I have to go because the landlord said I'm not supposed to be here. And I would have to show up, right, leave my office, go to the station, talk to watch commanders, to get them to clarify to the officers at the scene that they can't do that. They can't help a landlord illegally evict a tenant, that it's a civil matter, that what they're supposed to tell landlord is, this is a civil matter, so you have to go to the court. Not what they were doing, which is telling the tenant, you gotta go, right? So that was worse during the pandemic. It became a very big issue. So then tenant advocates formed rapid response teams. So as soon as they got wind of this happening, then they would show up, right? And that was, so that has helped so many tenants. Like I've talked to tenants that said, if it wasn't for them showing up like that, the cops would have helped my landlord evict me, and they helped me stay in my home. Just a week or two ago, LA Tenant Union members from the East Hollywood local, showed up because that was happening, where an elderly tenant here in East Hollywood was getting illegally evicted, and the cops were at the scene, doing the usual, yeah, well, your landlord wants you to go, so you got to go. And so, a group of LA Tenant Union members showed up, rapid response team, and got arrested, right? Because, cops are at the scene, they see a group of people showing up to advocate for the tenants. So that led to the cops arresting them. And me as someone that grew up having to interact with Rampart Crash, I just know that if you're not deferential, it's perceived as like you're not staying in your lane, right? So even asking a question could lead to you getting arrested for something. So yeah, I could see how that happens. So anyways, they ended up getting arrested for trying to prevent the illegal eviction of this low-income tenant in East Hollywood.
Wow. Yeah, that could be a preview of kind of coming events. I want to kind of try to end this on as upbeat a note as we possibly can, in these, really difficult times. Silver linings. Can you talk to me, start with you, Chancela Al-Mansour, with any silver linings you've encountered in your work recently? If you could share any specific examples of some stories that, kind of can give us a reason for hope.
Well, it was unfortunately for some cities a little bit too late, like cities like Portland, Oregon, and so forth, in terms of, but the good thing is that in the last couple of years, we've seen some of the strongest legislation come out, especially in the state of California and Oregon. Oregon used to have exactly the opposite. They used to have a mandate where cities couldn't pass inclusionary zoning ordinances and housing ordinances. They forbade cities from doing so. And then when they saw the crush of displacement, the legislatures were like, wait a minute, maybe we were kind of wrong in doing this, and kind of did a reversal in terms of implementing and saying, like, you have to have community benefits agreements before any development could happen, before city funds could happen. There have to be review boards and committee and local community participation to make sure that happens as well. We had seen advancements on the federal level and those things as well in the previous administration. We hit some serious roadblocks with the current administration, especially with the Affirmatively Furthering for Housing Act and the disparate impact theory and so forth. But all indications are that those acts will be renewed and so forth by the incoming administration. So I think there's some positive things that that housing activists are looking forward to when it comes to the new administration, and going back to, and really not not feeling like we're fighting everybody on all angles when it comes to this, but now saying that at least now we realize that we really have to do serious things. We have to have really strong community benefits agreements. We have to have really strong community participation. We have to have really strong measures that do affirmative marketing to people who need housing and that type of thing. So so that's the benefit I see is what we see in the horizon.
You know, we saw with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, she was able to help really put criminal justice at the forefront of the very vanguard of the civil rights movement. Is there a possibility of something like that coming along for housing? Because it really is as fundamental an issue, and it's connected in some very important ways, right? And so I want to get to Claudia first, and then I'm going to open up, come back to you with any response you might have to that, Chancela. Claudia.
Yeah, so I'm always a silver lining person. You know, I like making lemonade out of lemons, but it's hard right now. It's very hard just seeing that people are suffering. The pandemic has disproportionately affected communities of color. And then seeing in LA how gentrification, even during the pandemic, continues to spread, right? So I already know what neighborhoods will get hit, where those communities of color will then, you know, have to deal with all the predators, trying to force them out, trying to harass them out, and that makes me sad. So I think some silver linings are the growth in tenant organizing, even though it wasn't enough recently to, you know, pass the proposition that would have allowed local jurisdictions to pass rent control if they wanted to, right? Because the money that was poured into the opposition. And a lot of that money comes from the private equity firms that are now more and more going into the landlord business. So I would say a silver lining would be the growth in tenant organizing, the growth in attention being brought to these problems. Sort of a weird silver lining was that, you know, I read that like some areas turning purple, right? Going from like red to blue is because of people being forced out of their communities of color being forced out of their communities, right? And they're being forced into places like Georgia, right? So things like that. I just wish people didn't have to be forced out of their communities, because I understand the psychological trauma that comes with that, and it disproportionately affects communities of color. But I do try to focus on the few silver linings that I see.
And you know, it's long been part of the price that we've been apparently willing to tolerate and pay for capitalism as Americans, right? For, you know, capitalism tears communities apart all the time and flings children from their parents, and, you know, when they don't want to go a lot of times, and, you know, uncles and aunts want to stay, you know, in a place, but you know, the free market does that. And I don't know that we've thought seriously about that as a critique of the free market and something we want to put in the scales when we're weighing the cost and benefits of different policies, put in the scales the integrity of communities, the coherence, the maintenance of organic communities that have, you know, survived a lot of times generations of difficulties and the like.
Because the way you survive is your social support networks, right? That's you need them. You need your social support network, and your social support network is in your community, right? So then you're ripped from that. And just growing up, you know, my dad has a 6th grade education. My mom also has an elementary school education. I just felt coming from that, right, that you couldn't just keep your head down. I'm just going to go to work and, you know, eke out a living or raise my family, because the predators are always circling, and that's capitalism, right? The predators are always going to keep their eye on the most vulnerable, right, to take advantage of. And that's my experience, that low-income communities of color don't get the benefit of saying, we just want to work and raise our family and enjoy our time with our community, our social support network, because the predators are always circling. So they'll always come in and disrupt that. So
Yeah.
you don't even get that benefit.
Yeah, maybe next conversation, if we have more time, I would like to dive into the reason for the Black homelessness and the disbursement of the Black community. The reason why you see Black faces and not so much other faces, even other immigrant populations on the streets homeless. And that's because our community has been so dispersed and so forth. You know, Big Mama, grandmother died, lost her house, kids couldn't afford to buy each other out. So that house, gets transitioned. That common ground you talked about, incarceration, used to be a time if you were incarcerated, the bottom line, you get released, at least you can go home to your grandmother's house, your Big Mama's house, and so forth like that. Now there's no place for people to go to when they're released from foster care, when they're emancipated, and when they're finally taken out of the foster care system or released from something like that. There's no place to go but the streets and so forth. And it's.
But we're almost out of time, but I want you to follow up, Chancela, with how then can we make this a front burner? How can we prevent the proposition process, right? We lost in the proposition process because our message apparently wasn't cogent enough. We got to get a more cogent message. We got to get our organizing. We got to get the funding, all that. But how can we get this on the front burner?
We have to do what we're doing. I tell Black homeowners all the time, don't sell your homes, do whatever you can to try to look at other investment opportunities. Say the same thing to Mexican American homeowners as well. Don't sell your homes, don't stay invested, stay tuned in your community. Insist on community benefits agreements, go to your city council meetings, show up at legislative sessions, go to your city council members and your mayor and your assembly members and your legislator and be in their face constantly, because the squeaky wheel gets the oil. I think showing up, being more active, being more vocal will do it. Having policies that prevent using criminal records, for example, to keep people from housing, and those kind of policies as well would help.
Yeah. And I want to add in terms of getting involved, right? So a lot of the people moving into low-income neighborhoods, the gentrifiers, right? I think a lot of them consider themselves liberal or progressive. So just understand that your presence there has an effect on these vulnerable communities. So yeah, I'm calling you out and saying, what are you doing about that, right? If you consider yourself a progressive and you've moved into Echo Park in the last 15 years, Highland Park, you're part of this process that's hurting vulnerable communities of color. So what are you doing about it? Especially you get involved in trying to empower and give these communities agency.
Okay, thanks so much. I see with Olivia Hudnut here that's it. That's the cane coming out and pulling me off stage. But man, I learned a lot today. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you to everyone for attending and to our fabulous panel. I've learned so much today, and I feel like we all have. And now I'm starting to think we need a part 2 of this event. So I just want to throw out one announcement. There is an advocacy group of young professionals in Los Angeles that is doing work every week to talk to council members, talk to board of supervisors about the homeless situation that's going in Los Angeles and advocating for permanent supportive housing. If you guys can contribute, I'm going to throw the link to sign up for more updates about it into the chat. It's tinyurl.com/housingactionnow. So yes, let's get this to the front burner. Let's continue advocating for the people that have been muted and have been displaced in our communities. So thank you so much, everyone.
One last thing, go to Stay Housed LA. If you know a tenant who needs eviction defense in Los Angeles, there is an free eviction defense program that is starting right to counsel. And it's called Stay Housed LA is the .org is the website. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.